Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday night, 7 p.m. I am Eric Trexler, and this is a very special episode of whatever podcast you're listening to. And the reason I say that is this very special episode is a crossover episode. So if you are a member of the Mass Office Hours community, which is totally free, by the way, you don't have to actually join. You just have to stop in on YouTube. Then this is business as usual. Every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we show up on YouTube and we answer questions live. So if you're part of that community, welcome back. But like I said, this is going to be simultaneously an episode of Mass Office Hours and an episode of the Iron Culture podcast. So if you are a member of the Iron Cult and you are not joining in for Mass Office Hours every Wednesday night, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is you've been really letting yourself down, and you've been letting Dr. Helms down. The good news is if you're just hearing about Mass Office Hours and you like the type of content that Helms and I and Omar make, then there's maybe 100 hours of extra content just kind of sitting there that you didn't know about. So check us out. We do recordings live on YouTube on Wednesday nights. Then we post them later to all the normal big podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that stuff. So this is an official crossover episode. We're happy that you're here. And another reason that tonight is special is I am joined by the rare guest. We do not do a lot of guests on Mass Office Hours, but tonight I am joined by Josh Pelland. Josh, where are you at in your education right now? What level are we at?
That's a good question. As you know, with a PhD, it's kind of a little loose at times, but yeah. I'm a PhD candidate. So roughly speaking, I'm in the second half of my doctoral program. So fingers crossed that remains to be an accurate statement.
Very cool. Okay, so you're officially a candidate, which means you can do the PhD in parentheses C, and no one will know what that means, and they're going to think that you're just a PhD.
And then when I do complete the PhD, I lose a letter. So I'm just going to stay where I'm at right here. I have maximal letters behind my name, and that's ultimately what matters. So I think we're good right here.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. So you did your undergrad at Ohio State, is that right?
OH.
In IO. And that was in exercise science?
Yep.
Awesome. Who'd you work with there? Do you do any research when you were there?
Yeah. So this is kind of how it all started for me. Is I worked with Dr. Brian Vogt, who was just not only a fantastic researcher, but more importantly, a fantastic person. And he just introduced me to research in general. And at the time, it was more in the clinical population sphere. But Dr. Vogt, colleagues, and knew Dr. Zordos. I also met Zach Robinson, who recently completed his PhD. I know he's been on Iron Culture before. I met him through Dr. Brian Vogt's lab at Ohio State. So yeah, that's who I primarily worked with. There are some other fantastic faculty members there as well. Dr. Carl Marish, I don't know if you ever had him in class, but he ended up teaching a lot of my undergraduate coursework, and I'm very grateful for him because he did a fantastic job. And I'll be a Buckeye till I die.
Awesome. So Zach was at Ohio State as well?
Yep. He graduated a year and a half or 2 years before me, something like that.
Quite a pipeline from Ohio State to Florida Atlantic. So now you did your master's at Florida Atlantic with Dr. Zordos, and now you're working on a PhD. What's that program called again, the PhD program?
So the PhD is in integrative biology. So it's kind of a pretty broad program in terms of potential research interest. But as you know, when you kind of get to the PhD, when you get to that point in your education, it's more or less all about the research you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, my PhD was in human movement science, and it was a cool program. It was super interdisciplinary, but basically what it boiled down to was if it does or could involve movement, then it fits. So we had people who did concussion research. We had people who did biomechanics, neuromuscular control. I was over there doing like sports nutrition. So it is interesting when you get into PhD programs, a lot of them set the boundaries as being so broad as to be functionally meaningless, because it doesn't really matter, because what you're going to be doing, even if you do have a well-defined PhD curriculum, it's like your focus is going to be so narrow that it doesn't even make sense to try catering to like, hey, we're going to bring in 20 people in this cohort that are all going to study the same thing. It's just not going to happen.
It's by definition, you can't really do it that way. And so we're in South Florida. We're right, a couple miles from the Atlantic Ocean. So, I've seen maybe a couple dozen seminars on various marine biology and migration patterns, et cetera, et cetera. I pay attention for the most part and picked up on a few things on that front.
Yeah. I don't know how you feel, but personally, I've felt that that's really cool. Now I'm right now my official job, my office and all that is in evolutionary anthropology, so people come in and do lectures about, hunter-gatherer groups on the other side of the world, or conservation to protect a primate species in this jungle, or the evolutionary reasoning for why lemur ankles are shaped the way that they're shaped, and how that affects their leaping. And to me, I felt like it's really cool, because when you do bachelor, master's, and PhD all within like a fairly well-defined and narrow scope, you're kind of like, okay, I could do without another exercise science seminar for a couple years. Like, give me a couple year break, so it could be cool that way.
Yeah. And at this point, teaching some courses as well. And to me, that's been just as fruitful, if not more fruitful, for my own ability to kind of work through information, organize it in such a way and present it. Cause it's kind of a different ballgame. So that's been a great experience as well. But yeah, man, it gets on the research front, it gets very focused and very specific.
Definitely. Yeah. If you're doing it right, that's how it works. All right. So Josh, the reason that we have you here tonight is not to do a deep dive into your biography, although it is good to hear what you've been up to. But you made a lot of people very happy and a lot of people very upset, because you carry the burden of being someone who studies resistance training volume. And we were joking. I spend half of my time in the religion and social change laboratory, and the topics we cover are not nearly as controversial or emotional. They don't cut as deep as something as personal as training volume. So obviously, a lot of people are really into low volume training strategies. A lot of people feel completely the opposite. And recently, your group, with of course Dr. Zordos at the helm, you guys published a meta-analysis, or published a preprint, right? So presumably it's in peer review or will be shortly. But you posted the preprint, and it's called The Resistance Training Dose Response, Meta-Regressions Exploring the Effects of Weekly Volume and Frequency on Muscle Hypertrophy and Strength Gain. And just to go ahead and bias the audience here, I think it was really well done. Very, very well done paper. I've actually, just within the last few weeks, I've published 3 letters to the editor, which I had never done until literally this like wave of letters, because I just got annoyed of things not being done right. And this is an exceptional piece of research. And I could sit here and go on and on about how nice it is and try to summarize its findings. But as the person who was really pulling the strings here and writing the code and doing the analyses, I feel like perhaps you can give us a little overview of what you guys did, what you found, what it means in terms of practical application. And just so you know, this isn't going to impact what you're seeing, but I'll probably put the paper up over my face. And that way, as you're talking about certain things, especially if there are any like figures or tables that you want to allude to, I can certainly kind of scroll to those and provide a bit of a visual aid for people who are consuming the podcast in that medium.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. I'll start with a couple caveats. So as you mentioned, this is a preprint. This is version 1 of the preprint as well. It's not in peer review yet because in this case, we had a feeling that, okay, it's an updated volume meta-analysis and also a frequency meta-analysis, which I'm sure we might touch on as well. There's going to be feedback. There's going to be people that are quite interested in it, read it very closely, and if someone like yourself or another expert in the field or an adjacent field has a comment, whether they're a peer reviewer or not, that's a fantastic opportunity for us to address that in a subsequent version of the preprint, and then eventually for publication. So, fun fact, we've had multiple versions before the preprint itself, and we eventually just had to say, hey, we got to get this out there and get some feedback on it, because that's a feature, not a bug, I think. And you mentioned, I don't know if it was an analogy, but you at least brought up how contentious this topic can be, and it's compared it to the contentiousness of something like religion. And to ride with that analogy a little bit, I will say that with communicating this paper specifically, I'm going to try to be as agnostic as possible in terms of interpretation. I honestly think, I know I'm kind of jumping to the end here, but we'll get into what we did and what we found in a second. To jump to the end here, I think there's a lot of different ways that this can be interpreted. So, when I put my researcher hat on, I view my goal my role in the role of the research team to provide as much transparency as possible in that process, and address criticism, address limitations, and be the first ones to point those out. And hopefully that was relatively evident in the paper. And I'll also say that there is just so much to discuss here, not to butter up our research team too much, but like a lot of work did go into it, and it from start to finish, obviously it wasn't the only thing we were working on, but it was close to a 2-year process. And we recorded a 5-hour podcast discussing just one of the 4 outcomes. And we just released the second one. So the second of the 4 outcomes. And that one was about 3 hours. So there's a lot to dive into, and I'll keep it pretty high level here and see if there's anything you want to dive into. So ultimately,
before you get into that, where can people find those podcasts that you've already put out?
Yeah, probably the best place is just to go to YouTube, type in data-driven strength, and you'll see those pop up.
Awesome.
Season 1, episode 1, and season 2, episode 1, and season 2, episode 2 are up as of recording this. So
that's eventually going to be like 12 hours of podcast over this paper.
Yeah, 12 and probably a little bit more, because there's just a lot to go over here. And if you decide to go down that road, listen to those podcasts. You're not going to get that time back. If you decide to go do that, you are not going to get the time back. I guarantee you that.
Well, they might. Okay. And the reason I say they might is perhaps those podcasts will convince them to be a little bit more efficient with their volume, and maybe they actually will get that time back and then some on the back end if they decide that they've been doing more volume than they need. Who knows?
Hey, there we go. I like the way you think. And that actually is kind of one of the ways we presented the outcomes themselves, is via what we called efficiency tiers. But how do we actually get those results? I think it's important to take a step back, and I'm going to frame what we did with this project primarily around the effects of volume on hypertrophy, because it's probably the most heavily discussed, because it's quite controversial. But we did 4 main analyses. So the effects of volume on hypertrophy, the effects of volume on strength, the effects of frequency on hypertrophy, and the effects of frequency on strength. So in terms of a little bit of background for the effects of volume on hypertrophy, there have been multiple previous meta-analyses, and very well done meta-analyses. Those meta-analyses were done, like the most recent one was 2022, so we have some additional data. They also had quite different inclusion criteria, but most importantly, for the most part, their analyses were categorical in terms of continuous. So what do I mean by that? So at the end of the day, if you are a coach or a practitioner, you can choose any volume you want. You can do 8 sets, you can do 9 sets, you can do 19 sets. But in the case of these previous meta-analyses, for one reason or another, most of them have been done categorically. So, hey, we're going to kind of bucket less than 10 sets and bucket greater than 10 sets, for example, see what those different effect sizes are, see if those are significantly different, and make conclusions as a result of that. And those are great ways to look at the question. But at this point, with this amount of data, and I think particularly for practical application, we're quite interested in the nature of the continuous response. So, okay, is this a linear response where as you do additional sets, you see a consistent increase in hypertrophy or strength gain? Or is there a plateau at which point there's clearly no more hypertrophy once you get to a certain point? Or maybe there's even an inverted U, which is a common notion in the sense that you do additional sets, eventually you get diminishing returns, and maybe you even get to the point where additional sets, maybe they produce too much muscle damage, maybe some other factors are at play, and it actually starts to, you see worse hypertrophy than you otherwise would have with less volume. So those are questions that people speculate about, and we weren't quite satisfied as a research group in terms of the statistical approaches up to the current point for answering those. So that was our goal, is we want to best describe the nature of the continuous relationships for these four questions, right? And that included the whole process of searching through databases of studies, extracting all the data. We ended up with, I think it was 67 total studies looking at the effects of volume and or frequency on hypertrophy and strength gain. And then from there, we did quite a few things in terms of analyses. But Eric, is there anything that you think is worth double clicking on in terms of methods?
No, I mean, I think just for context, you hit the highlights. So, you were looking at essentially gathering, systematically searching to find studies that would meet your inclusion criteria. Generally, just trying to find the studies that actually shed light on those 4 questions and do so in a way that kind of, could easily facilitate a pooled analysis. So just I'm reading here. Basically, you're looking for studies that were published, obviously, before you did the search or by the time you did the search, written in English so you could figure out what they were saying. Use a dynamic resistance training intervention with eccentric and concentric training, usually using a randomized experimental design, minimum of 4 weeks, healthy subjects, did not involve individuals over 70 years old, compared at least 2 groups who had differences in set volume and or frequency while controlling for load and proximity to failure, and included pre-intervention and post-intervention measurements of hypertrophy or various parameters of strength. And I like this one, number 7, not retracted or called into question by Andrew Vygotsky. So Andrew, props to you. You are now in the literature as a person who decides unilaterally what research may not be commented on. It may not be included in meta-analyses. Of course, I'm being facetious. But yeah, I think it's, while I'm being facetious, I do think it's valuable to actually make that type of decision of saying, I don't care if it's retracted. We have reasons to, feel very strongly that it should not be included in the analysis, because if anyone's been around for a minute, the process of retracting papers is about as far from perfect as you could imagine. And so we can't just kind of outsource our critical thinking and say, well, I guess if it's not retracted officially, then it must be fine. So I really like that. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify for folks like exactly what kind of studies were being included here. And of course, folks who are listening along, if you want to dig in and kind of get a better feel for the characteristics of these studies, then of course you're welcome to do that. The preprint is available. And as long as my memory holds up the way I'd like it to, then I will post a link to it in the show notes. So yeah, you guys, you did your systematic search of the literature. You weeded out studies that didn't fit. That process brought you from almost 6,700 search results all the way down to the 67 that were ultimately included. So I guess if you want to briefly talk about kind of the modeling approach and then kind of get to the results, and we can kind of, start getting into the fun stuff.
Cool. There's a couple things I'll note regarding the inclusion criteria, because that's fundamental to meta-analysis, right? So previous meta-analyses on volume and frequency have included older adults. That could be a feature, that could be a bug, depending on your perspective. So that is something worth noting. A good amount of kind of the best cited volume and frequency analysis have had somewhere in the ballpark of like 25 to 50% of included studies, including older adults. Another thing is that we only included direct measurements of hypertrophy. So previous meta-analyses have included ways of looking at body composition that wouldn't be direct and thought to be quite as sensitive as something like ultrasound measurements or MRI measurements, which are thought to be kind of, again, the most sensitive ways of detecting changes in muscle size. So
so like prior meta-analyses would include things like fat-free mass from a DEXA or a bod pod, or even a skin fold test, for example. So looking at whole body fat-free mass, obviously that includes literally every tissue that isn't fat, whereas you guys were looking at actual direct measures of hypertrophy at the muscle level.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then now, to be fair, there are some previous analyses that, they did sub-analyses with just direct measurements. But in 2023, 2024, when this process kind of occurred, we had the luxury of enough data that we were like, there's enough out there that we can statistically model what we have in terms of just the direct measurements, whereas maybe, 6-7 years ago, that wasn't quite the case. And regarding the specific nature or the direct nature of the muscle size measurements, it's important to note that we also took a different approach to the independent variables. So the independent variables in this case are volume and frequency. In previous meta-analyses, it's been a little bit inconsistent in terms of frequency, and honestly a little bit unclear in terms of how frequency is defined. But then on the volume side, I think a limitation that folks have pointed out is that any contribution of the measured muscle to a set was just counted as one set. So if you are doing, if you're training bench press and tricep extensions, both bench press and tricep extensions would count as one set for triceps hypertrophy, which makes sense, right? It's kind of it's hard to be objective with that. But what we decided to do is, hey, we're going to take that approach that previous meta-analyses have done. We're also going to do two other approaches. So one approach we did is we counted volume and frequency with just direct sets. So in the case of bench press for triceps hypertrophy, that wouldn't count at all. Only direct arm extension training would count. We also included a fractional method in which that indirect training counts as half a set. So in my mind, kind of the first step here was determining which of those methods of quantifying volume and frequency were the most likely to describe the underlying data. So we had to do our statistical modeling first of all of these outcomes, right? The 4 outcomes that I mentioned. And we also did each of those 4 for our total method, our fractional method, and our direct method. And step 1 in kind of the results is saying, hey, which of these models was most likely to describe the underlying data? So I believe it's figure 3 in the paper. We have some grids that basically represent Bayes factors comparing these different methods of quantifying volume and frequency. And the good news for interpretation here is that it was pretty clear cut that the fractional quantification method was just considerably better across the board. So in other words, that basically tells us that indirect training definitely counts for something, but it's almost certainly not as contributory to the stimulus, or I should just say as stimulative as a direct set. So somewhere around quantifying those indirect sets in the 50% range in terms of a set or volume or frequency equation seems about right. So that's a big change from previous analyses, is that in our mind, you got to get the independent variable as dialed in as possible to give yourself as a researcher the best possible chance of modeling the dose response relationship with maximum accuracy.
Yeah, I mean, you got to know what the dose is if you're going to do dose response. Definitely.
Exactly. So that was step one, and that's quite a big change. And some of the best fit models were different depending on the quantification method. So that again goes to show that matters, and I'm glad we did that, even though it was a bit of a pain to extract it in basically 3 different ways. But I kind of skipped ahead there because ultimately, what we did is as we've alluded to, dose response modeling. So effectively, what this is what's called a multi-level meta-regression for each of these outcomes. So there's a term called nesting, which basically allows you to make sure that the analysis focuses on within study between group effects, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're doing a study at Duke and I'm doing a study at FAU, and we're trying to answer a similar question, there might be inherent differences just between the cohort observed, the length of the study, the training status of the individuals, or maybe just the training environment that could influence the just average effects between the two groups. So that's important to keep in mind, is it's not just taking all the effect sizes, chucking them into Excel or Google Sheets and pressing the best fit button. There's quite a bit more that goes into it. So we had to include what's called fixed effects for a few important factors that certainly impact the amount of hypertrophy or strength gain that someone's going to get. So whether the cohort was trained or untrained, how long the study was, and then we also did some other fancy stuff that, again, you can dive into the 5-hour podcast if that's of interest to you. But that basically allows us to get this nice continuous best fit relationship between volume and frequency and hypertrophy or strength. So that allows you to explore different functional forms. So if you look at the paper in the methods section, I believe it's 7 functional forms that were tested for what provides the best fit model. So one of those is linear, right? Maybe it is true that as you do more and more sets, you see a linear increase in muscle growth. Or maybe it is some nonlinear form, or maybe there is some sort of spline that occurs that kind of initiates that inverted U that we discussed before. And basically the statistical software aims to use those different models to best describe the data, but it also prioritizes simplicity or parsimony to some degree to ensure it's something that doesn't overfit the data. And ultimately, this process, this multi-level meta-regression process, gives us a best fit dose-response relationship for each of these outcomes for the independent effect of the independent variable, volume or frequency, and the dependent variable, hypertrophy or strength. And that's what's displayed as kind of the main plot there in the paper, main plots, plural, figures 4 and 5. What do you think of that process, Eric? Anything to clarify for the folks at home?
No, that's great. And I mean, you can get into the mathematics. You mentioned the balance that you try to achieve with modeling between, explaining as much variance in the outcome as you can, getting that really nice fit, while also valuing simplicity and parsimony. And, you could get into the math behind it and, kind of quantify the efficiency of going one route or another. But, I found that the real theoretical underpinning is actually really intuitive, especially if you think the best way that we could possibly fit the data is with, a cubic spline model that just has like 100 knots in it, right? And so what that means, by having more knots, it means that the best fit line is allowed to basically get more and more squiggly and go and capture each little data point within the data set. And so then the question is, okay, you fit this model that has a 100 knot bendy, twisty, chaotic line. Then what? you have to explain to someone what that best fit line actually indicates. How do you summarize that when there are 100 different turns and parameters to discuss? And ultimately, you find that as a model gets more and more complex, there are obviously mathematical downsides of how that's calculated, but even just at a practical level, the complexity gets so heavy that our puny human brains can't even really comprehend a synthesis of what that really means. So yeah, anytime you're doing modeling, you want to. Now, of course, you can miss the other way as well, right? If we find this relationship where, as you're adding more sets, things are totally plateauing and you just fit it with a linear best fit line, any software out there is going to let you do it, but you're really mischaracterizing the nature of that relationship. So yeah, I think you guys did a fantastic job with it, a very, very thorough approach. And at this point, I think we can probably just briefly summarize the results. Would you rather start with frequency or volume?
I think we can kick it off with volume. And I very much resonate with what you said, because it's absolutely a science, but it's to some degree like at the end of the day, decisions have to be made in this process. And that's why, again, like we said at the beginning of the show, transparency is very important regarding how exactly that process occurred, because a different statistician might take a different approach. And I think ultimately, as a researcher, and also when I do endeavor to do the science communication thing, it definitely should humble you, right? In terms of our ability to understand. At the end of the day, we're trying to understand what the true dose response relationship is, but there is a high likelihood that our findings are not the definitive dose response relationship. In fact, I feel quite confident that that is the case. Yeah. So that's important. But ultimately, we think it's still the best approach we can take, because instead of saying on the front end, hey, I wonder if more than 10 sets or less than 10 sets is better, instead what we're saying is, what's the best way to describe the data we have? And then on the back end, let's try to describe that relationship and present those results in the best way possible. So that's ultimately what the dose response models are. And if anyone's following along in the paper, that would be table 2A as well, kind of describes some categories, if you will. But again, that's more descriptive and more of a reactive approach to what our findings were, as opposed to a proactive approach of a specific cut point that we might be interested in. In terms of the volume findings themselves, there's a lot of ways, honestly, to go about describing these. I think the most fundamental question for a dose-response relationship is, does it tend to go up? That's just a really good starting point, right? Yeah. And that it's a little bit trickier than you might imagine in terms of making that decision. So basically what we did and what we presented in the paper is the marginal slope at the average of the volumes from all of the effects. So don't quote me on this, but off the top of my head, I think it was like 12 or 13 sets for hypertrophy, and then maybe a little bit less than that for strength. So we basically said, hey, what is the point estimate of the slope at 12 or 13 sets for hypertrophy, and what are the credible intervals around that? And is that positive, right? Is that slope positive? So just generally speaking, does it go up? And the short answer is yes. The slope for hypertrophy was, I think, 0.24% at the mean value of volume, and the credible interval was entirely beyond zero, meaning, hey, we can feel pretty confident that yes, there's a positive dose response relationship. But at the end of the day, I think everyone would kind of agree with that. Like, even someone that's quite low volume, they know that you don't have to. They know you have to do more than one set a year, right? They know that there's a dose response relationship. So the question is, what is the nature of that dose response relationship? Is there a plateau? Is it linear? Are there diminishing returns? And ultimately, what we found is that while it's a positive dose response relationship, that relationship has diminishing returns. And those diminishing returns accelerate as you get to higher and higher volumes. So as a rough heuristic, the first 4 sets are about 3 times efficient as the final 4 sets, maybe even more than 3 times as efficient. So while we didn't find evidence of a plateau in our best fit model, we did find quite strong evidence that the earlier sets are quite a bit more efficient and honestly pretty dramatically so. Now, it's also important to note that there's not a ton of data at those higher volumes, and you can just kind of see that visually in the plot. Once you get to like 25 fractional weekly sets, man, there's not a whole lot to go off of there. And as a result, you do see those confidence intervals or the credible intervals kind of widen. So, in a lot of ways, our model here, and just the data itself, is absolutely still compatible with other functional forms, whether that be a plateau or even an inverted U beyond 20 to 25 sets, or maybe the way that we've described in our model 0 to 20 sets is also a little bit off as well for one reason or another. But ultimately, we do see this positive dose response. There are pretty strong diminishing returns, but the best fit, the point estimates themselves, did not necessarily indicate a plateau, which is quite interesting. I definitely think people are interested in why or why not, that might not be the case, because for strength, we did find a plateau, and I can dive into that if you'd like, Eric.
Yeah, because right now on the screen, listeners can see both the hypertrophy and the strength figures or the panels of Figure 5, and I think it's you don't have to be a statistician to say, hey, those look different, right? So with volume, we do see diminishing returns, but not anything that you might call necessarily a hard plateau. Again, maybe we'll see in the future that people fill in, that 30 to 40 weekly set range with more and more studies. Maybe it does end up looking like a plateau, but for now, we have really no strong justification for that either way. But when you look at the strength figure, for people watching the screen, that's at the bottom left, we see this really sharp increase from 0 to something. But what appears to be a very flat plateau that actually is arrived at pretty quickly. So how would you kind of characterize these findings?
Yeah, this was probably the second most interesting or surprising finding on our end, because there was definitely a positive dose-response relationship. So, those initial sets are very robust in terms of strength gains. But like you said, it plateaued quite quickly. Now, where that plateau occurs, I think is kind of up for individual interpretation. Part of our methods here, we're defining a smallest detectable effect size just based on the random variation you might expect from resistance training studies in general. And if you use that criteria of like, hey, what can we confidently say is a dose response or a benefit of volume beyond typical error we see in research, that plateau happened around 4 to 5 fractional weekly sets, which is quite low. So we do see a positive dose response, but man, the dose response plateaus quite quickly. Now, there's a lot of caveats, I think, to both of these curves. At the end of the day, when I think about a hypertrophy study, and especially a volume hypertrophy study, it's not saying, hey, Eric, or hey, listener, or hey, whoever, go make the best gains you can in a 20-year training career. It's, hey, you have 10 weeks. The average study duration was 10 and a half weeks. Hey, you have 10 and a half weeks. Go make the best possible gains you can. Go, your current muscle thickness on the ultrasound is, I don't know, 6 centimeters. Go try to increase that value as much as can in 10 and a half weeks, right? Now, on the flip side, for strength, oftentimes these are novel strength tests. So it's not like you have a powerlifter, with a 1,000+ pound total, and they're very familiar with these strength assessments. Maybe you do have a powerlifter, but maybe you're testing them on an isometric leg extension, for example, or because we did include isokinetic and isometric strength tests. So I think there's a lot to discuss here in terms of practical application, but the point I'm circling around here is that you have to keep in mind the context of the included studies, right? Because this isn't just like, hey, this is the dose response relationships we now know to be true. These are the dose responses observed within the context of the included studies, and you got to keep that context in mind.
Yeah. So I think it'd be really cool while we're on the topic of volume to kind of briefly summarize what we're looking at in Table 2. So Table 2, kind of summarize what you call the volume efficiency tiers, both for hypertrophy and for strength. So since we just talked about strength, let's keep that thread going and talk about table 2B. So if I am interested in getting strong, obviously people are going to be saying, okay, well, how many weekly fractional sets ought I be doing? What was your kind of main takeaway from this table 2B?
Yeah, my main takeaway here is that this is one way to conceptualize the results. I think that's very important to double click on. Like, there was a time in the manuscript and reporting process that we were going to have like 3 or 4 versions of these tables, because the way that these tables were created, or the criteria for these efficiency tiers, we thought was like the most balanced way possible, but nonetheless, they were decisions that us as a research team had to make. So basically what we did is we said, okay, we mentioned that smallest detectable effect size, and we also have the point estimates at each volume from the models. So effectively, how long does it take for the model to indicate that we have done enough volume to see a strength gain, if we're talking about table 2B, to see a strength gain that is greater than the smallest detectable effect size in terms of that point estimate? Because we can be roughly confident, we have at least 50% confidence that that would be a quote unquote meaningful strength gain. And for strength, that happened at 1 set, and that basically determines what we termed the minimum effective dose. So just 1 set from the included studies, it seems that you can make substantial or detectable strength gain, again, in the context of these studies. We saw quite high efficiency from 1 to 2 sets, enough for another increment of the smallest detectable effect size. Then the diminishing returns start to occur not too long after that, right? We see enough of a strength gain up to about 5 sets for a couple more increments in that smallest detectable effect size. And the point estimates do go up in that 5 to 10 or so fractional weekly set range, but they are smaller than the smallest detectable effect size. So as a researcher, when I put my researcher hat on, I can't say, yeah, I'm very confident that, again, in the observed studies from 5 to 10 sets, that increase in strength gain is greater than error. But ultimately, I think what jumps off the page for most people is, man, on average, strength gains were maximized somewhere in that, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fractional weekly set range, which is probably lower than a lot of people might expect.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So it's definitely good news if you're someone who, maybe you have a tight schedule, crunch for time, you train, exclusively for strength, and you're like, man, I feel like I'm doing just way too many sets in the gym, too much junk volume, quote unquote. I'd love to be more efficient with my training, but I just don't think I can spare the gains. Like you said, it may be that you're doing a much more inefficient approach to training for strength than you really are. You might have a misconception there in terms of how many fractional weekly sets are really necessary there. But the table above it, table 2A, looking at volume efficiency tiers for hypertrophy, when I was kind of introducing you at the beginning of this episode, that's where I spent most of the time, most of the focus with the intro, because I think this table, I think a lot of people, frankly, if I'm being totally candid, looked at the figure we talked about and were like, I'm not totally sure how to interpret these units. But when they jumped to table 2A, I think that's where a lot of feathers got ruffled and a lot of preconceived ideas were conflicted with. So, so minimum effective dose for volume, which is kind of, just the sufficient to elicit that smallest detectable unit of hypertrophy. So that was 4 fractional weekly sets, which makes sense that it's low, right? You do something, and that's going to be better than nothing because you're training instead of not training. Now, the higher efficiency, kind of jumping up to that next tier from the minimum kind of detectable hypertrophy, that was 5 to 10 fractional weekly sets. Now, jumping up from there into intermediate efficiency was 11 to 18 fractional weekly sets. Jumping up from there, which was called the lower efficiency tier, was 19 to 29 fractional weekly sets. The lowest efficiency tier was 30 to 42 fractional weekly sets. And then the unclear was 43 plus, and the description for that is insufficient data to inform efficiency or potentially less hypertrophy. So basically, you're kind of in no man's land up there. There's just not enough data to really fill in with a high level of confidence. Where is this best fit line going? Because ultimately, the best fit line follows the data. Now, I think a lot of people, well, I'm certain a lot of people for a long time now, there have been a couple splashy, really high volume studies, and people have said, that's dumb. There's no way that you could possibly squeeze any more juice out once you're getting beyond, 20, 25, maybe 30. So certainly that's why a lot of people were a little, I would say, bent out of shape about these findings. But how would you characterize these findings? I mean, being someone who has a kind of an eye on not just the research, but also the practical side. Well, what did you make of this, I guess, when you first were kind of crunching the numbers and seeing the results?
Yeah. I haven't done as much research as you, Eric, up to this point, but I've done enough to learn that you definitely can't predict how folks will interpret things. So when we, we're like, okay, what makes sense to put in the primary manuscript? Because anyone that ventures into the supplementary materials will see there's a lot more to check out. What do we think is going to be the most transparent way or most important things to put in that in the manuscript itself? We were like, hey, if we just have that main model of volume and hypertrophy, people are just going to look at it and be like, man, it goes up and it doesn't stop going up. But we're like, no, if you actually understand the underlying data, like, man, those diminishing returns are quite notable. Maybe they're not as much as some people expect, and honestly, they weren't as much as I expected. But I think it's important for folks to be able to kind of quantify those diminishing returns. So that's where the volume efficiency tiers came in, and we conveniently did the smallest detectable effect size, and it worked out well to present them in relation to that smallest detectable effect size. In my mind, man, I look at that and I say, yeah, sure, there might be some benefit to be had with quite high volumes, but in a lot of ways, I expected people to look at that and be like, oh yeah, that efficiency is quite wild. Like, think about going from 30 to 42 additional sets. That is basically what that table indicates, at which point you would have decent confidence of getting another detectable increment of additional hypertrophy. At that point, especially if you're doing a balanced training program, you're basically putting an additional reasonable training program on top of an already high volume program. So put another way, man, I was kind of thinking at first, this does a great job of demonstrating those diminishing returns, but in a lot of ways, it was kind of the opposite, which I thought was quite interesting. And you mentioned that, some people might be skeptical of high volumes above 20, 25, 30 plus fractional weekly sets for those to be, to meaningfully increase hypertrophy. And I would actually say that our data decently support that. So that lowest efficiency tier says that, hey, if you go from 30 sets to the end of the data set effectively, so like 42, 43 sets, yeah, there's a decent chance there will be a meaningful or a detectable increment of additional hypertrophy. Another way to think about that is any comparison slightly above 30 compared to the end of the data set is unlikely to elicit meaningful hypertrophy. So in the supplementary materials, we have these contrast tables, which basically compare every single possible combination of volume and the likelihood that the hypertrophy from the main model is greater than the smallest detectable effect size. So in other words, if you were to compare 31 to 43, that has a less than 50% chance to be greater, for that hypertrophy to be greater than the smallest detectable effect size. So in my mind, as a rough heuristic, one way of viewing the data that I kind of resonate with, or I think is a pretty balanced way to look at it, is once you get around 30, 31 sets, the model would indicate that beyond that, it very well might be a plateau. Again, the best fit is slightly still positive, but it's uncertain and it's quite inefficient. So I was honestly kind of surprised that the knee jerk to the table for a lot of people, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it just happened to be a bit of a misprediction on my end, was that, man, it just doesn't stop going up. To me, I view that as, man, that's pretty dang low efficiency and a decent bit of uncertainty at those higher volumes. And in a lot of ways, just subjectively knowing the underlying data and also practical application, What I'm really interested in is more reasonable volume ranges. Sure, some people like Helms might venture to go to those really high volumes if he's looking to eke out every last drop of gains, or someone someone else kind of in that category. But for me, I'm really interested in those high efficiency tiers because training is typically fitting around a lot of other things in my day-to-day. So that's my perspective. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there's a lot of ways to view the best fit models here. And this is one way of looking at it. And there are some additional ways in the supplementary materials as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of description and explanation. I think another way to kind of conceptualize it, perhaps, you can tell me if you agree or disagree, but I know a lot of folks in the evidence-based fitness world are used to seeing training variables compared in the context of like a pretty straightforward, we had 3 groups that were doing 10, 15, or 20 sets, and we did an analysis of variance and tried to figure out which ones had more or less gains than the others, right? And I think it seems to me without like literally crunching numbers, it's like you could envision this as like a group of people doing 5, 10, 15, and 20 sets, right? Like 4 groups doing a study. And it's like, will the 10 group, likely be, or, I make it easier. Will the 15 group likely achieve more hypertrophy than the 5 set per week group? You can have a pretty good amount of confidence as long as the sample size isn't super tiny. But then you're getting into like, 10 versus 20, maybe. 15 versus 20, it might be even less likely, So it'd be the type of paper where if this were just like, and not that you should have, because it's I really like the way that you presented this, and I'm not just saying that because people are listening. I'm not just being nice. I don't really have that bone in my body when it comes to research, but I'm not mean, but I'm just very like direct and candid about this kind of stuff. But like, I think if people were to see this in a way that they were more familiar with, which kind of fits that like typical set volume study paradigm, they would see like, oh yeah, so like you go up from 5 to 10 and that's good, and 10 to 15 is still kind of good, and like 15 to 20 maybe not worth it to me when I'm looking at the bar chart. So yeah, but Josh, you're going to find this soon enough. You keep doing resistance training research. A lot of folks will look at it as a very dichotomous thing, right? So what they want to know, like one of the words that has probably haunted me for the last several years, and I'm being a bit of a hypocrite because sometimes I lean on it, sometimes I don't, but optimal is the word, the kind of imperative word in evidence-based fitness. And so people want to know, what is the optimal hypertrophy? And they always want the answer to be framed. Not that I'm criticizing it, like I totally get it, but a lot of people want to know, what is the optimal weekly set volume for hypertrophy? And if you're not sure, err on the higher side, because I don't want to leave gains on the table. That's kind of like the perpetual bias that a lot of people go into this question with. And so you would look at this table and, Josh, I think the way you described it is extremely measured and balanced and accurate. But if I were a person who adopted that particular perspective and set of biases, I would look at this table and say, well, I guess 42 or 43 is it, right? So you can kind of understand, to me, as I get older and more tired and less excitable, I'm basically ancient now. I have grown more interested, not in making people agree with me, but in kind of stepping back and observing, what is the disconnect here? Like, why are people talking past each other about a particular topic? And why are they so angry about the number of sets per week? But I think this is a great example where if your approach is, I'm interested in efficiency and kind of reflecting the meat of this distribution as accurately as possible, I think your description does well. But if I came into it saying, I want optimal and I'm always going to err on the side of more instead of less just to be safe, then that's where people will look at this table and say, wait a minute. You're telling me that I need to spend that much time in the gym to optimize my gains?
I think it's important to keep. That is a fantastic point, and I think that's ultimately where some misinterpretations can come in. But it's important to keep in mind that, at least in my view, the goal of dose response modeling is to inform the best fit based on so describing the available data of the physiological relationship. And it's not necessarily there to make practical recommendations, at least in my opinion, because there is absolutely the chance that there is some selection bias in the included studies here. Let me give you an example. Someone, if we have a prospective participant for a training study with us, we'll have them come visit the lab, tell them about the study, and if maybe they had a recent injury related to an exercise they're about to perform, or maybe you kind of describe a little bit about the potential training programs they might be randomized to, and they kind of get not like scared off, but they're a little hesitant, and maybe they don't, show up for that pre-testing visit. We didn't venture to quantify the degree of dropouts at higher volumes compared to lower volumes. If I were to redo the extracting, I probably would, but maybe there's a bias towards more dropouts at higher volumes. I don't know. But ultimately, there's a possibility that there are indirect negative consequences to higher volumes that are impossible to account for statistically here, right? Again, these studies are basically saying, hey, on average for 10 and a half weeks, go increase that measure of muscle size as much as physically possible. A lot of training does seem to do that. And again, that uncertainty seems to really increase beyond 25, 30 fractional sets. But again, that is quite, in my view, quite a narrow perspective on training, because if you go and you maximize everything you can for a week or for a block or for 10 and a half weeks, and then that takes away from how much volume you can do for the rest of the year because you get injured or you get burnt out or you just have to deload every 5 weeks instead of every 10 weeks, that's a net negative, right? And that's impossible for us to account for in statistical models because by definition, they had to start the study and they had to finish the study in order to be included in the data set here.
Yeah, and that's, I'm glad that you highlighted that because especially in exercise science, resistance training literature, typically speaking, when people report their results, they're doing just a per protocol. If you didn't finish the study, we're throwing you out. You don't see a lot of, even at the original study level, a lot of people who are doing well, here's the per protocol, here's the intention to treat, and, we're going to try to kind of make the most defensible decision about what ought to be imputed as their post-test value, and we're going to explore the reasons for dropout.
There were zero intention to treat analyses, which I'm not saying is good or bad, but I did the study grading, and there might have been one or two, but yeah.
Yeah, and just so folks know, that's one of those terms that a lot of folks listening, that's not going to jump out as a term that they recognize or have a lot of familiarity with. And it's precisely because what you just said, people in our area are not really incorporating that. And I'm not I don't view it so simplistically as to say all the fancy biomedical science people use it, so therefore we should always use it and it's always better. I've seen many instances of strength and conditioning or exercise science literature where I'm I don't think an intention to treat analysis would even do me any good here based on the research question. But nonetheless, a per protocol approach is what you're used to seeing, which is basically, hey, we signed up 25 people in each group, 2 dropped from each group, so we ended up with 23 in each group. So all the data you see in the study, all the results are for those 46 people who actually completed the study.
To be clear, that's what our lab does too. So it's not a good or bad thing. It's just of note, right? When you're interpreting the data.
Yeah, and so the reason that you see it a lot more in the way I put it, fancy biomedical research, is because a lot of times, if, for example, you're studying a medical treatment, it's not just a question of what happens when a person implements this treatment perfectly with absolutely perfect adherence and everything goes well. What is the difference between pre-testing and post-testing? Sometimes you do want to know, first of all, do people actually tolerate this treatment? If they don't tolerate it well, how does that impact their adherence? And for people who do not tolerate it well and waver in their adherence, what actually happens, not when someone does this intervention perfectly, but when you simply when you prescribe it to them, right? So if you give someone a nasty medicine that tastes terrible and you find they only had it 65% of the time just because they hated taking it, well, when you're a doctor prescribing that medicine, your typical patient response is not going to be the 100% perfect adherence. It's going to actually be the 65. And so that's why, in certain medical instances, you need to know not what is the best case scenario outcome, but what is the actual outcome that occurs when I write that prescription and hand it to them and they walk out the door, right? So for a lot of strength and conditioning exercise science questions, that doesn't really apply or make a lot of sense or really have direct relationship to the research question. But when we start translating these models to address some of the things you just mentioned, which is like, well, when we actually then tell a client, here, go do this program with this much volume, what is the kind of short and long-term ramifications of doing that? And so this analysis very effectively answers the kind of basic question you mentioned, which is a 10-week sprint to make the most gains possible. What would you do? But it doesn't tell us, and apparently, it may not be really good data, even if you dig for it, of, well, does going one route versus the other increase your likelihood of getting hurt or dropping out because it's just too much? It's not a practical program, or you just get totally burnt out. Those are the questions that as a practitioner, you have to kind of layer in over top of the physiology.
Totally. And I think you also have to account for the model uncertainty, right? Again, in that 5-hour podcast, I just feel good that it's out there, that we cover these things at one point. That way I don't have to belabor the point too much here. There are a couple statistical considerations for why I think, if anything, the diminishing returns might be slightly, the diminishing returns might be greater than they're reported here for a couple statistical reasons. So in other words, greater
diminishment, they flatten out more?
Exactly. Okay. Greater diminishment. So less and less efficiency compared to the initial sets as you go.
More of a plateau, so to speak. More of a plateau.
Yeah. Something resembling more of a plateau near the end. And again, those highest volumes are quite uncertain just due to little data. And then also, a lot of these studies are quite unbalanced, right? If I'm measuring bicep and tricep hypertrophy as a researcher, you better make sure that they're training biceps and triceps probably first in the session, so that those have the best chance of growing maximally, because that's what you want to see as researchers. You want to see muscle growth to be able to detect a difference if there is one, and you need to get off the finish line to do that. So sometimes if it's an upper body training program, lower body training is completely unsupervised and it's up to them, right? So the question becomes, okay, does this apply to a full body program? And my answer is, I don't know. That's not the job of the researcher. That's the job of the coach. That's the job of the practitioner, right? Now I can give my opinion as a coach or as a practitioner, as a trainee myself, but that's not really the job of a dose response model, right? Once you start to consider a full body program, maybe you start to consider a caloric deficit. My mind starts to go to, is there like an adaptation capacity? At which point, just the total adaptation under the curve, or in this case, the total hypertrophy under the curve for all muscles, is it just impossible for that to increase past a certain point, and therefore you must hit a plateau relatively early on, right? I don't know. It's very hard to answer questions to that degree of granularity, but I just think there's a lot of uncertainty here, and I'll finish this little rant by saying that I think this is really cool outcomes the more I sit with it for a hypertrophy, because not only does it show that if for whatever reason lower volumes fit you better for tolerance reasons, for time reasons, for preference reasons, those can elicit great hypertrophy. But it also indicates that there are levers to pull if you do want to maximize an experiment and if it fits within practical considerations. So for me, for example, and I kind of hesitate to use my own anecdotes, but whatever, I'll let it rip here. I have some muscles that, especially lower body muscles, that just have such a hard time tolerating more than, say, 10 sets a week. Whereas I've had great success with training arms or lateral delts with some of those more quote unquote extreme volumes, or at least I tend to think that it's been beneficial with no real issues with tolerance. And that's cool, right? Because that is quite compatible with the data, in the same way that different perspectives of low volumes being best, high volumes being best, moderate volumes being best. In a lot of ways, I think our data is quite compatible with all of those perspectives. And I'm hopeful that podcasts like this and other communication we do can help people kind of see that. And by looking at the best fit model and also the limitations thereof.
Yeah, definitely. So it's 8:06, and I know that you have done 4 or 5 hour podcasts on this. We're going to try to not do that tonight because I'm old and I need my sleep. But I was hoping that maybe I'm going to put the figures up on the screen. Maybe you could give us the kind of like 10-minute summary of what you found in terms of the frequency findings. And while you're doing that, I would encourage folks who are on YouTube right now in the live chat, if you have any questions specifically on this topic that you'd like Josh to address, and I will chime in and try to contribute to the conversation. But if you have any questions on this topic, those would certainly be welcome in the live chat, and we'll probably wrap up by seeing if we have some questions to address. In the meantime, though, we had people in the chat who mentioned it is important to pay the tax, which means hitting the like button when you are watching live here. And if you're not watching live, every little bit helps. So be sure to like the video. And we got people chiming in from all over, Josh. We got people in Las Vegas, Toronto, Santa Cruz, California. I saw some other international countries shouted out in the chat. Switzerland, not bad. I think
nice.
someone mentioned Japan in there.
What's been the most unique location you guys have gotten?
You know what? My politically correct answer is that all locations are equally unique. We all have,
or maybe uncommon.
Yeah, we all have only one set of coordinates on the map, so
this is
places equal. Finland,
Eric, we are where our feet are.
Exactly. Finland chiming in to say hello. So, I don't know. We do tend to have a pretty good international contingent who chimes in. It's tough because, we do this live and we've kind of tried to figure out the best time to do it. And it's tough, man, because everyone on the mass crew is like super busy. And then you're thinking, well, who would be able to join in if they're on the East Coast or the West Coast or Europe? But all of that is to say, yeah, we get people from all over the place, which is fantastic.
I always find it cool getting feedback from a country I wouldn't necessarily expect, or it's always cool to like someone mentions, hey, our currency doesn't have the same power here. Like, can you help me out with a discount? It's like, yeah, man, of course. Like that would be an honor to do so. It's always as much as the internet can be a little bit frustrating at times. It's a really cool thing for getting like-minded folks together. Yeah. The first comment actually was someone who lives in Germany, but is in Japan currently. So that counts as two. So I'm going to call that the most unique one. We have Germany and Japan chiming in as the same person. That is tuning in even while they're traveling, maybe on vacation.
What a good way to spend vacation. I'll just put that out there. Not a big fan of this comment that says, "Oh, it's Trexler, I'm out of here." I'm here every single week, so I don't know what you expected. I don't know why you thought I wouldn't be, but that's a very hurtful thing to say. All right, so let's go with like a little 10-minute rundown maybe of the effects of frequency. I didn't hear as much gnashing of teeth with regards to the frequency findings, but I'm sure they're still very informative and applicable regardless. So yeah, let's take a look at those and then see if we have some good questions in the chat.
Yeah, so I'll start with the effects of frequency on hypertrophy. So the goal here, just to be clear, is to look at the independent effects of frequency on hypertrophy. So these are all accounted for the effects of volume. So the question is, just from a basic level, hey, if I'm doing 12 sets in a week, does it seem to matter if I do all 12 sets for that muscle group one session, or do I get a benefit from breaking it up into two sessions of 6 sets, or maybe 3 sessions of 4 sets, right? So that's the fundamental question we're looking to answer here. So on the x-axis, you can see the weekly frequency, and then on the y-axis, you can see the expected response. And then on the right-hand side, similar to hypertrophy, you can see the estimated slope at the average frequency. So the estimated slope at the average frequency was pretty low. If you just think about it conceptually, the estimated slope was about 0.3%. The average frequency was about 2. So what that means is right around a frequency of 2, the independent effective frequency, so technically that would be like going from 1.5 frequency to 2.5 frequency, the estimated independent effect would be an increase in hypertrophy of 0.34%, and the credible intervals around that do overlap with 0. So it doesn't seem to be a robust, consistent, reliable effect. And if you contrast that with volume, one set had an estimated effect of 0.24%. And just fundamentally, the unit of a set is just so much less than increasing frequency by 1, right? Just in the sense that our model goes from 0 to 45 for volume and 0 to 6 for frequency. So the long and short of it is that it might lean a little bit positive in terms of independent effects of frequency, but the uncertainty is quite wide. It wasn't a consistent effect. And the effect, if there is one, appears to be quite small, again, in the context of these studies. There's a lot to discuss there because this goes for all training variables, but this might even be a more important consideration for frequency in the sense that it relies quite heavily on other variables. So there's some schools of thought that, hey, maybe the per session volumes in those frequency studies were too low to see a benefit of additional frequency. So in other words, just to put it simply, the effects of frequency would only show up with really high volumes. And also there's another perspective that if you train with high enough frequencies with too high of weekly volumes, you can't recover in time to benefit from the higher frequency. So put simply, the weekly volumes in the included studies are too high to see the beneficial effects of frequency. So you kind of have these two different perspectives, and I'll spare you the long crash course, or the long explanation of whether some of those do or don't have evidence for them. I'll refer you to our recent podcast we actually released today on frequency. But in short, not a big effect there for hypertrophy. That's opposed to strength, which we did see quite a bit of an effect for frequency. But Trex, I can't tell if you're about to mention something.
Nope, that's just how I always look. But
okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, looking at panel A in that figure, you can see with when hypertrophy is the outcome, there's just really not much to write home about within the context that you described. But as you were getting to, very, very different stories showing up in the figure when it comes to strength.
Yeah, this was an interesting one because previous meta-analyses, you had the odd analysis here and there showing an independent effect of frequency on strength gains. But the effect in our analysis was quite strong. And it's almost impossible to kind of compare and contrast the volume curves and the frequency curves. But if you were to just take a high level view, it's like, man, that looks like a more robust relationship in terms of the effects of frequency compared to the effects of volume. Now, I think that's for quite a few reasons. I think the fractional approach was quite important here. I also think the fact that we explored so many different nonlinear functional forms is quite important because while there does seem to be quite a strong effect of frequency, the diminishing returns are quite strong as well, right? So going from a frequency of 1 to a frequency of 2, man, that's a big improvement there. And you could maybe even say the same for 2 to 3, but beyond that point, the diminishing returns definitely seem to accelerate. And again, you got to keep these in the context of the included studies. My general take home from the strength data, when you kind of combine the volume stuff and the frequency stuff, is that performance might matter quite a bit here for strength gains. So if you were to think about doing 1 session per week and just increasing volume, so going from 6 sets to say 10 sets, you're pretty fatigued for sets 7, 8, 9, 10. And that might take away quite a bit from the strength stimulus because your fatigue state is not very specific to the strength assessment, right? But in the case of frequency, you might get some benefit to breaking up those 6 sets into 2 sessions of 3 sets, or maybe even 3 sessions of 2 sets, because you're going to have time to recover and perform well for those initial sets. Again, that's almost only furthered by the fact that these are probably novel strength assessments, and therefore any contributory effect of hypertrophy on strength gains might be a little bit less in this context compared to a powerlifter that's been training for 20 years and is looking to get the extra, 10 kilos on their total. But yeah, the long and short of it for the effects of frequency on strength is pretty reliable and consistent increase, pretty strong effect here. But the diminishing returns are also quite strong. And those diminishing returns only accelerate.
Yeah. And it looks like, things are really starting to flatten out by my view, maybe around the weekly frequency of about 3 sessions per week. Is that how you interpret it?
Yeah, I would say in that ballpark, like if you were to look at the estimated effect from 3 to 4, that definitely would not be greater than the smallest detectable effect size.
Yeah.
From 2 to 3, that's actually not quite greater than the smallest detectable effect size either. But again, that increase from 2 to 3, don't quote me on this because I'd have to actually do the math, but that increase from 2 to 3 in terms of frequency might be in the same ballpark as going from like 6 to 10 sets, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that's helpful for practitioners to know. Now, I will say, in our coaching practices, we mostly I would say most. I'd say about 3/4 of our clientele have some sort of strength goal, and in my experience, frequency is something that is quite tolerance dependent. So, in other words, if you were to just take these results and say, okay, I'm going to start deadlifting 3 times a week as a result of that, I would be like, man, like I'm not doing that because I don't know many folks, especially quite strong folks, that can tolerate that. But hey, if you can tolerate it, and that's quite common to be able to tolerate it for bench press, for example, there might be inherent benefits to slightly higher frequencies within those practical considerations, kind of like we talked about for the effects of volume on hypertrophy. I think it goes both ways there.
Awesome. All right, good stuff. Yeah, so I tell you what, let's talk through a few questions, and we'll get everyone out of here and have a lovely night. So, we had one question here. Let's see. So, I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but since you're closer to this data, maybe you will. And if not, no big deal. But the question is, do the recommendations for strength also include accessory hypertrophy training for a specific lift? Does that make sense to you as a question?
Totally.
Cool.
So the short answer is yes, but any training that trained the included muscles for the strength assessment, but wasn't the strength assessment itself, counted as half of a frequency or half of a set, right? So the short answer is yes, but it was accounted for in the sense that it wasn't quite as specific. Now, in the other quantification methods, total and direct, we took a different approach there. And again, the first figure in the paper, figure 3, provided evidence that fractional approach of accounting for quote unquote accessory work for a strength assessment did seem to have an effect, but it wasn't quite as effective as training the strength assessment itself.
So if, for example, in a study where the strength assessment is the squat, you're saying that if they had a program where they're doing squat, lunges, and leg press, the lunges and leg press would count for half of a set? And
half of a set?
The squat sets would be 1 set.
Would be 1 set.
Okay, exactly. Cool. All right, now that I have the answer, I understand the question. So I'm totally on board with that. So
that's a good question.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so someone actually asked a question that we totally got to. They're asking if we could kind of talk about the disconnect between what's theoretically optimal and then what's kind of practically optimal, and we consider, all those things that we talked about in terms of fatigue, injury rates, things of that nature. So
this might be a good time to layer in the recommendation that we've kind of been workshopping, and I'll give it a rip right here and
sure,
see what you think. So before, or what's quite common in our field is to give numbers for recommendations, again, kind of based on those categorical cut points. But in our view, those are a little bit finicky and might give the impression of taking options off the table. So instead, we said, hey, people are going to look to us for recommendations. So what is our recommendation? And in our view, it should be more conceptual in nature. So specifically for the effects of volume on hypertrophy, what we've landed on is that, hey, more volume will likely lead to more growth, but the returns are smaller and smaller until it starts working against you. So more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you. So again, we're taking into account positive dose-response relationship, diminishing returns, quite notable diminishing returns, but obviously everyone's going to have their own individual practical considerations, at which point it might work against you, and it's actually not smart to use a higher volume. That's where our heads are at.
Cool. Now, you mentioned, you threw out the bone there, so I'm going to have to chase it. So the idea of working against you, you've mentioned, I think you've made it very clear that the evidence that we're seeing here does not directly support the concept of an inverted U in terms of that relationship between weekly set volume and hypertrophy, but it's also not strong enough to refute the possibility of that existing, right? So obviously you can only speak to the range of data that have been observed. And once you start getting above that 25, 30 set per week range, the data are so sparse that it's hard to really have much confidence at all of what kind of relationship we're seeing up there. But we did have quite a few people who were asking about that concept of the inverted U. So someone asked, first of all, where did that come from initially? And then second of all, I think it'd be interesting just to hear, getting away from, what you can or can't say based on the actual modeling. I'd be curious to hear if you think there is eventually that point where things start to actually tilt downward rather than just no longer tilting upward.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes, and I think it has to, because there are some studies out there that I would classify more as muscle injury studies. So we're talking taking untrained people off the street, having them do protocols of 60 maximal eccentrics, which, by the way, that would make me sore. I've done protocols like that while I was already trained. That made me sore for 10 days. That would make people untrained, again, probably more in the muscle injury category. And it has been observed that muscle atrophy can occur from protocols like that. So to me, yes. But then the question becomes, is that ever something that is going to occur within a reasonable program? So I think it does occur. Where it occurs, I don't know. If it's even possible to get there with just dynamic, eccentric, concentric resistance training with a fixed external weight like we do in the gym, I don't know. I honestly don't think it's the right question in a way, though, as a lifter, as a coach. I think probably what's more likely at this point is, hey, is there a plateau? Once we get more data, if so, where does that plateau maybe start to occur? And if we don't see a plateau, what's the degree of diminishing returns? That's where my head goes from a practical perspective right now. But physiologically, I do think it does occur. It just might be quite far off there.
Yeah, and so those studies that you categorize as more muscle injury studies, do you think that's where the concept of the inverted U kind of originated?
No, I don't. And I had to do quite a bit of digging to see if it's possible for atrophy to occur from anything resembling resistance training, because I was really interested in this question. And that's actually something we have in our podcast queue. So it might be something we dive into with some more depth. But I also did a pretty deep dive in terms of, hey, where did this inverted U concept come from? And basically, there are some studies that do show slightly worse growth from higher volumes, right? Sometimes it's statistically significant, but pretty rarely. Sometimes it's just, a smaller absolute effect. Now, Eric, I'm sure we could go back and forth for 2 hours about sampling variability, measurement error, and all of the various factors that can contribute to different studies having different findings, which, hey, we do discuss in the mentioned podcast on our YouTube channel. But basically, it kind of comes from that fact that there are some high volume studies that might show, there are some volume studies that might show the higher volume condition does see slightly worse growth. And then there's also just conceptually the muscle damage question, right? Is hey, presumably as you train, you're going to experience more and more muscle damage. It's thought that before hypertrophy can be the main thing that your body is focused on. It has to take care of the damage first. So if you're just accumulating a ton of damage, then you might get that inverted U. So kind of part outcome-based from actual studies, part theoretical in that sense. But I think, again, in the context of a reasonable program where the repeated bout effect is present, I think it's unlikely that muscle damage is going to lead to a dramatic inverted U. But that's just my opinion. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, and I would be happy if happy to change my mind if that is the case.
Awesome. So got a question here. Within this analysis, when you're talking about hypertrophy volume, or volume for the hypertrophy, or I think also as for the strength analysis too, they're really curious about what counted as a set. If there was any particular rep range that studies had to fit, any particular proximity to failure, and if there was anything to do with kind of handling studies that used what are often called like intensifying techniques like drop sets, rest pause sets, myo reps, things like that. So was it just a rep is a rep is a rep?
That's a good question. So everything, so the way to think about it is, in order for a study to be included, it had to have everything consistent except for the volume and or the frequency. So if I had a high volume group training at 3 RER and a low volume group training to failure, that study would not be included. So proximity to failure had to be controlled. Rep range had to be controlled because those could be confounders. Now the question becomes, what was typically the case? Did they typically train to failure? Did they typically train with 20 reps? Did they typically train with 3 reps? Et cetera, right? What was the average rest periods? And that's important to keep in mind, as we've mentioned a few times, in the sense that you need to, when you're looking at the results, it's only descriptive based on the context of the data. So that's why we reported figure, let's see here, figure 2, which is basically just descriptive plots of weekly sets, weekly frequency, average rep range, average rest period, and the proximity to failure. And there's a little bit more detail about the proximity to failure in the manuscript itself. But the short answer is the study itself to be included had to only manipulate volume and or frequency.
Good stuff. I had just taken the paper down to show my face again because I was like, we're not even using the paper anymore. I should put that thing away. And then we're referencing figures again. But yeah, so figure 2 is really cool. It's up on the screen right now. Gives a really good, one of the challenging things with a really ambitious meta-regression project like this is it can be so hard to kind of explain everything concisely. And I think a good figure and a good table can go a really long way. I really like the idea of presenting this specific information in the form of a figure. I think that was a really smart way to do it.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope it's helpful. And there's, a very common thought with the volume research is, did they train to failure, right? Because that might influence the dose-response relationship. And about 75% of the included effects would be classified as failure. Now, I will say failure is kind of a hard thing to define. And we classified a study as failure based on a multitude of different definitions of failure. My preferred definition of failure is momentary failure, meaning if I got the last rep, even if I don't think I could try another one, or even if I don't think I could get another one, I still try it, right, to check my work, if you will. Only about 30% of the hypertrophy effects fall under the category of momentary failure. The about 45% of effects that were failure, but not momentary failure, were maybe 0 RER in the paper, or maybe they were repetition maximum, which is a little bit harder to confirm the proximity to failure. So short answer is, for the most part, they seem to be trained to failure. If I had to guess, I have pretty high confidence. Most of the effects in the study, in the included hypertrophy studies, were like failure or 0, 1, 2, maybe 3 RER. But I can't say for certain, just because reporting of proximity to failure is something that hasn't been great, but it is improving. So that's good news.
All right. So we got a question from someone who's training full body 6 days a week. So 6 training sessions per week. And they're curious about how many exercises you might recommend per session and week for someone who is power building. So they're interested in power, getting stronger and building some muscle. And luckily, they didn't leave you totally hanging. They put some numbers out there. Do you think 4 to 5 strength sets, strength-oriented sets, and 7 to 8 hypertrophy. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. 4 to 5 strength exercises plus 7 to 8 hypertrophy exercises for about 3 sets each would be okay. Yeah. What do you think about that?
That seems pretty reasonable. Assuming that is for the entire body, that seems quite reasonable. Now, if that is like per muscle group or per movement pattern, I'm a little concerned. But across the week, that sounds quite reasonable. If you're doing those strength movements twice a week, you're looking at, call it 8. I'd call it a slot in that case. 8 slots throughout the week. 7 hypertrophy movements plus 14. I try not to do public math. That'd be about 22 slots a week divided by 6 times a week. Yeah, a little more than 3 exercises per session. That sounds pretty reasonable to me.
All right. Good stuff. Now, there's a running, I would call it a joke, but it's not funny and it's not kind. But there was a running scheme in mass office hours where they asked me about lengthened partials every single week. And I am not a science denier, but I have been jarred and perhaps even alarmed at the sheer volume of questions that we get about lengthened partials. But anyway, someone asked, essentially, do you think that matters? Like, do you think that would kind of play into some of the relationships you're seeing more specifically? If you're doing mostly shortened partials versus mostly lengthened partials, how might that impact maybe, the efficiency of increasing sets? I think the general idea there is that a lot of people say it's harder to recover from some of these like exercises that are biased toward a lot of tension in the lengthened position. So do you think that would, I assume that all these studies were doing full range of motion training. Do you think that things might look a little different if they weren't?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's 2 parts to this answer, and I'm going to keep it a little bit more general, and I'll try to not make it too wordy. So someone might come from this perspective of saying, if I'm doing lengthened partials, and let's assume that a lengthened partial is more effective than full range of motion, which that is a very long discussion in and of itself. But let me just take a step back from there and even say proximity to failure, right? If we assume that training closer to failure on a per set basis leads to more hypertrophy than not training to failure or just training many more RIR away from failure. So what I'm circling around is the efficiency of the dose. If you were to do better exercise selection, better proximity to failure, maybe longer rest periods, you could make the argument that would increase the efficiency of the dosage. Or maybe I'll just say the effectiveness of the dosage, how good that dosage is. Does that influence the dose response relationship, right? I've been training for 10 years. I'm amazing at, just executing training. I think there's something to that, to be honest. Again, exercise selection isn't individualized in these studies. I think that's a very interesting question that I don't know the answer to. We did a whole bunch of moderator analyses. Those moderator analyses are just unbelievably limited. And I wouldn't read too much into them, but we did pre-register them. So therefore, they're in the supplementary materials. There's mixed evidence there. Some analyses show that, hey, proximity to failure doesn't really influence the dose-response relationship. The rest period one, depending on if you look at it continuous versus categorical, that might influence whether there's an effect of rest period moderating the dose-response relationship. The short answer is I don't know in terms of effectiveness of the dose and its influence on the dose-response relationship. What I will say, though, is I think you should start by making sure each set is as effective as possible, more or less. I think that makes sense, especially given we do see a relatively strong dose response, at least up to, say, 10 to 20 sets per week. That seems to be a reasonable conclusion that we can have a decent bit of confidence in at this point. So in my mind, you want to get everything you can out of each set. Again, within reason. That doesn't mean absolutely everything is to failure. So again, practically, I think it does make sense to maximize the effectiveness of each set to some degree. Now, in terms of fatigue, in my mind, that's where the practical considerations we talked about, right? So more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you. If you're choosing exercises that seem to be really fatiguing for one reason or another, they don't agree with your body, maybe there's just a ton of tension in the more stretched position, that might have an influence on working against you. and might take away from, might kind of determine where that volume gets capped. So, then that gets to a discussion of, should I choose exercises that are easy to recover from? I don't know. Again, I would just focus on good quality efficiency and then modulating the dose within practical constraints from there.
All right. Good stuff. Little question that someone asked, which is a good question here. So the studies that were included in this meta-analysis, was it common for the studies to measure both strength and hypertrophy, or did you get a lot of studies that were just strength and just hypertrophy? What was that kind of distribution like?
So if I recall correctly, every single study had some sort of strength measurement. There might be one or two exceptions. And only about half of the included studies measured hypertrophy. So there were a lot of studies that only measured strength outcomes, but didn't measure hypertrophy, not really the other way around.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hypertrophy can be a bit of a pain to measure. A lot of folks, their studies...
You need equipment.
You need equipment and a lot of folks, if you have the training equipment, then theoretically you can test strength, right? It kind of guarantees that it's going to be happening.
And those studies that just measured strength tended to be a little bit older studies. Maybe when you didn't have the ultrasound cart and you're measuring using circumference for hypertrophy, but that wouldn't meet our inclusion criteria. It had to be ultrasound, MRI, muscle biopsy, something direct.
Yeah. All right. I think we got one more here that we can get to. This question is about training for a cycling team. And so there are sprinters on the team, and the sprinters do strength training. And if you've ever seen sprinters in the cycling context, they have absolutely enormous quads, generally speaking. So the question was, how would you apply this data for training sprint cyclers? Would you maybe stay on the lower end, maybe 5 to 10 strength sets per week, and then, free up a lot of that training time for being on the bike? Or might you consider pushing that a little bit higher?
Man, that is a good question that I am almost certainly not a good person to ask about, but it does remind me of some of the possible implications here for powerlifting training, because while powerlifting is a little bit more clear-cut, yes, that's clearly a strength event. Depending on your definition of a strength event, you could also say that, this goes to show how little I know about this, but like a sprint cycling event is a strength event in a way. So that starts to get to a higher level discussion about potential periodization approaches. And in this case, also fitting in the resistance training with minimal or at least calculated impacts on your sport performance training, right? And the degree to which you might tolerate that degree of impact on your specific cycling training might change over time, right? So maybe you're okay far out from competition, training with higher volumes, getting the potential additional hypertrophy as a result of that if you don't have a race in 2 weeks, and it's okay if your race performance or your cycling performance is down a little bit, right? But then as you get closer to competition, oh, sweet. So long as I'm strategic with my weekly setup, maybe I choose my proximity to failure appropriately, my rep ranges appropriately, my exercise selection appropriately. Oh, this is cool. I can probably get a robust stimulus from pretty low volumes. And again, if I place it appropriately within the week, I can probably at least maintain or continue to see some improvements in strength and hypertrophy, and therefore potential improvement of performance as well as I get closer and closer to competition. So I think it's like a sliding scale in terms of how you'd approach that based on proximity to a competition, but massive grain of salt there because I'm kind of, taking bits and pieces from how I would conceptualize this for a powerlifter and applying it to something I have almost no knowledge about.
Fair enough. I lied. There's two short questions that I think would be really nice to address before we go.
Cool.
One of them, I'm just kind of curious. So they mentioned, or you mentioned, I should say, that, I believe you mentioned that your upper body can generally tend to handle more set volume than your lower body. And And I'm very certain that Helms has said that many times as well, that he goes really, really high with his upper body set volume, especially in comparison to his lower body training. And someone asked in the chat, it seems like that's pretty common. Does that match your experience, or is that just kind of two people and it's more of an even distribution out there in the real world?
I'd say on average, in my experience, that seems to be the case. If you look at like just an average powerlifter's program, the bench press training is probably going to be higher in frequency and higher in volume compared to squat and deadlift. Now, as I say that out loud, you might want to group squat and deadlift training together because they're both primarily lower body movements. But still, even if you were to add that up, a good amount of powerlifters do more bench press training and just can tolerate more for the upper body. But I wouldn't say that that's true across the board. I just speaking to my client roster, again, on average, probably a little bit better tolerance in the upper body. But I've a couple guys, they happen to be very strong bench pressers, that their tolerance for deadlift might even be better than squat. So on average, yeah, but definitely not unanimous. I'd take it case by case and honestly muscle by muscle.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you, in this meta regression, did you do moderator analyses to look at the impact of training status?
Yes, we did. So the short answer there is I'd have to run through my head again the 4 different outcomes. But for the effects of volume on hypertrophy specifically, the linear slope was not, the difference in the linear slope was not meaningful. So in other words, the dose-response relationship seemed to hold between trained and untrained individuals.
That is, by the way, I'm going to bail you out. That is what the question was about. I kind of like did a shorthand question from something in the chat. They were asking a little bit about specifically the relationship between set volume and hypertrophy as the outcome. So it sounds like in your analysis, they were wondering if it differs for trained and untrained people. In your analysis, it didn't seem to make a huge difference.
Yeah, and part of the reason I don't remember that moderator for all 4 off the top of my head is because there's a lot of moderators, and also because just the more we probably spent 2 or 3 months hashing out the best statistical approach to the moderator analyses, because we just kept running into no, that's a massive limitation. We need to change it, etc. At this point, I think it's simply hypothesis generating, and it might be a substitute in the absence of additional evidence for practical application. But I'm more interested in another researcher or our lab group seeing something there and putting it to the test, because these are effectively all indirect comparisons. And you would need individual controlled trials to answer those specific questions. But they might provide some insight.
Cool. Yeah. So genuinely, sincerely, and in a very meaningful way, this is the last question I'm going to ask. I love it. People keep dropping these good ones in at the 11th hour. But this one's really good. I think it's very practical, which makes it a good one to end on. The question was, purely from a practical perspective, I don't have MRI, ultrasound, et cetera. I can't look for indices of muscle swelling and all that. How do I know when volume has, in your words, started working against me? Is it the type of thing where we're looking at, performance drops from week to week? Is it perhaps something more practical where I'm just I am clearly spending too much time in the gym, or I keep running into nagging injuries? For you, what are some of the key criteria that can help someone decide when they've kind of pushed it a little past what would be advisable for them?
I absolutely love this question. I'm glad we didn't skip it, because this is a important clarification to that conceptual recommendation that I mentioned before. And that when I say more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you, for that until it starts working against you point, that is not necessarily related to what do I respond best to. It's not necessarily a claim about individual differences in what volume is best for you in terms of what you respond best to. And Eric, I know you're pretty familiar with this because you were a collaborator on my colleague Zach's dissertation on individual response variation. our lab basically studied this or collected the data for this for almost 2 years. And the manuscript isn't out, so I can't refer you to anything, but I would say my mind has fundamentally shifted on the degree of confidence that we can have in saying, Eric, you're a low volume guy, I'm a high volume guy, or vice versa, right? Based on some performance outcome we see in the gym, based on any other analytical tool, even if you had lab equipment. Okay. So when I say, so ultimately what I'm getting to, let me just make one clarification. We should just be very humble in making claims about what we respond best to. I think there's just a lot of oversight in terms of just the degree of error present and variability present. So again, we studied that for multiple years, more to come in the coming months on that from our lab. But when I say until it starts working against you, I'm mostly talking about practical things. That can be high fatigue to the point that performance starts dropping, because that's probably an indication that, yes, this is too much here. If your performance is literally going down, that could be aches and pains. But beyond that, I view it as like a values-based thing personally, right? To what degree is training a priority in your life? For me, it's pretty important, but candidly, there are multiple things that I put above training right now. So I fall on the relatively low volume side of things. That's more from a value-based thing. And so to me, higher volumes would work against me in terms of my personal values. For someone that has a little bit more time to train, awesome. Working against you might mean a more tolerance-based thing in terms of their ability to sustain training, deload with a reasonable frequency. You might want to monitor some things like mood. You might want to monitor some things like sleep disturbances, and then just ensuring, probably more from a binary perspective, performance trends, as opposed to saying what maximizes my performance trends, because I think that's honestly a slippery slope.
Perfect. That is a fantastic answer. And I think that's a great spot to wrap things up tonight. So, Josh, really, really appreciate you being so generous with your time, talking us through these results in detail. Really informative. We got some great questions, so I do want to thank everyone in the chat. But Josh, before we sign off here, if people want to stay up to date with your work and maybe watch some of your 4 or 5 hour podcasts, where are the best places for people to find you?
Yeah, presumably you are listening on YouTube or a podcast platform of choice. So just type in Data Driven Strength there. You should find our show. We've been investing into that with some upgraded equipment and all that good stuff. So hopefully it's a nice experience. That would probably be the best place, to be honest. If you're interested in other odds and ends like our newsletter, you can just go to my Instagram, josh.datadrivenstrength, and you can see everything linked there. And I want to thank you and the rest of the MASS team, and hey, the Iron Culture team as well, for having me on. I've been an avid listener for a while, so cool full circle moment here, and very much appreciate your insight and your perspective as always. And again, just to emphasize, this is our best guess, or this is the best thing we can do with the available data, and hopefully it's come across that our goal is to push this area of research forward, provide some insights, not provide the definitive answers. Because we've really been proactive in trying to not bake our biases, even if we do have some, into our interpretation and communication here, and try to be as open-minded and acknowledge various perspectives. So hopefully that came across. And if you're interested in us belaboring that point even more, you can check out those long podcasts we mentioned.
Perfect. So that wraps things up for tonight. You have either been listening to MASS Office Hours or the Iron Culture podcast. In any case, I appreciate you. And if you normally listen to one and not the other, you should probably check out the other, because they're not so dissimilar. You might find that there's a big old catalog worth of content for you to dive into and enjoy. So that does it for us. I will be back in exactly 7 days with another episode of MASS Office Hours. Everybody have a fantastic night and have a fantastic week.